During breakfast, my 6-year-old grandson looked up from his cereal. "Daddy does something weird to your car after you leave." The words hung in the air. I kept my voice calm. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Then he said 4 words that saved my life. "He touches the brakes. Where are you watching from today?" Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Now, let me take you back to how I got to this moment, sitting in my daughter-in-law Sarah's pristine kitchen, coffee growing cold in my hands while my world crumbled around me. 3 months earlier, I thought I had the perfect life. Donna Jenkins, 58, living in suburban Milwaukee, with my husband Brad, of 22 years. We had our routines, our comfortable existence, our Sunday dinners with my son Tyler and his wife Sarah and little Kyle. I taught 3rd grade for 30 years before retiring last spring. Brad worked construction management. Steady income, good benefits. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Tyler was my son from my first marriage. I'd been a young single mother when Brad came into our lives. Brad had raised Tyler from age 8, been more of a father to him than his biological dad ever was. Tyler called him Dad. Kyle called him Grandpa Brad, and for 22 years we'd been a real family. Brad had been acting strange lately, though. More attentive than usual, almost overly solicitous about my driving. "Maybe I should follow you to the grocery store," he'd say. "These winter roads can be tricky." He'd started insisting on walking me to my car each morning when I went to volunteer at the literacy center. Sweet, I thought. Protective husband behavior. How naive I was. That Tuesday morning, Kyle's innocent observation hit me like a sledgehammer. Children see everything, don't they? They notice details adults miss because their minds aren't cluttered with the assumption that people they love would never hurt them. "What kind of touching, Kyle?" I asked, keeping my voice light while my heart hammered against my ribs. "He crawls under there and does stuff with tools. Real quiet like. Then he wipes his hands and comes back inside." Sarah was loading the dishwasher, not really listening. She worked as a dental hygienist and had early appointments. Tyler had already left for his job at the power company. Just me, Kyle, and the weight of his words. "Does Daddy do this a lot?" I asked. Kyle nodded solemnly. "Every time you visit. After you drive away, he goes out there with his flashlight thing." My blood turned to ice water. Brad had been alone with my car multiple times recently. Last week when I'd visited for Tyler's birthday. The weekend before when I'd babysat Kyle overnight. All those times Brad had walked me out, hugged me goodbye, watched me drive away with what I'd interpreted as loving concern. I managed to finish breakfast without alerting Sarah to my internal panic. When it was time to leave, I kissed Kyle goodbye, my hands shaking slightly as I gathered my purse and jacket. "Drive safely, Donna," Sarah called from the kitchen, same as always. "I always do," I replied, but the words felt different now. In the driveway, I stood beside my Honda Civic, key in hand, afraid to get inside. What if Kyle was right? What if Brad had done something to my brakes? The drive home was 15 minutes of winding suburban roads with several steep hills. That's when I realized something that made my knees weak. Brad had a $2 million life insurance policy on me. I called my mechanic from Sarah's driveway, hands trembling as I dialed Ray Patterson's number. Ray had been maintaining my car for 8 years. If anyone would tell me the truth, it would be him. "Ray, it's Donna Jenkins. I need you to look at my car immediately. Something might be wrong with the brakes." "What kind of wrong, Mrs. Jenkins?" "You hearing squealing? Pedal feels soft? I think someone might have tampered with them." Silence. Then, "Mrs. Jenkins, that's a serious accusation. You sure about this?" "I'm not sure about anything anymore. Can you meet me somewhere? I'm afraid to drive." Ray agreed to come to Sarah's house. I called her from the driveway and made an excuse about car trouble. She rushed out, genuinely concerned, helping me figure out what to do. Sweet Sarah, who had no idea that her father-in-law might be trying to murder her mother-in-law. When Ray arrived in his tow truck 30 minutes later, he went straight to work. I watched him slide under my car with his flashlight, Sarah making nervous small talk beside me while Kyle pressed his nose against the living room window. Ray emerged after 10 minutes, his face grim. "Mrs. Jenkins, we need to talk privately." Sarah excused herself to get ready for work, taking Kyle inside. Ray wiped his hands on his coveralls, avoiding my eyes. "Well?" I asked. though I already knew the answer from his expression. Someone's been at your brake lines, ma'am. Recent work, too. Not professional work. Whoever did this wanted it to look like regular wear and tear, but they made it sloppy enough that complete failure was guaranteed within a few more miles. The world tilted sideways. How many more miles? Hard to say exactly. Could have been today, could have been tomorrow, but soon, real soon. I thought about the route home from Sarah's house, the steep hill on Maple Street, where I always had to brake hard for the stop sign, the busy intersection at the bottom where morning traffic moved fast. Ray, I need documentation, photos, whatever you can give me, and I need you to fix this quietly. Mrs. Jenkins, this is attempted murder. You need to call the police. Not yet. I need to understand what I'm dealing with first. Ray spent another hour documenting everything, taking photos from multiple angles, making notes about the specific type of damage. This wasn't random vandalism, he confirmed. This was targeted, deliberate work done by someone who knows enough about cars to make it look accidental. Brad had worked construction for 25 years, but before that he'd served 6 years in the Army as a combat engineer. He knew explosives, mechanics, and had what he called practical problem-solving skills from his military training. He'd rebuilt car engines as a hobby since his 20s, said it reminded him of the equipment maintenance he'd done overseas. After Ray towed my car to his shop, Sarah drove me home. I sat in the passenger seat of her SUV, making conversation while my mind raced. How long had Brad been planning this? The insurance policy was purchased 18 months ago. He'd insisted on it after his friend Jim died unexpectedly, leaving his wife in financial trouble. Just want to make sure you're taken care of if something happens to me, he'd said. But it wasn't a policy on his life. It was a policy on mine. At home, Brad was in the garage working on his workbench. He looked up when I walked in, smiling that familiar smile I'd loved for 22 years. How's the car running, honey? Any problems on the drive home? Fine, I lied smoothly. Ray's going to do some routine maintenance tomorrow, though. Thought I'd catch any issues before they become expensive. Something flickered across Brad's face. Too fast for most people to catch, but I was looking for it now. That's smart, he said. Can't be too careful with car maintenance. No, I thought. You certainly can't. That evening, I cooked dinner like always. We watched television like always. We went to bed like always. But I lay awake until 3 a.m., listening to Brad's breathing, wondering how many other ways he'd considered killing me. When his breathing finally deepened into sleep, I slipped out of bed and went to his office. Time to see what other surprises my loving husband had been hiding. Brad's home office was off limits to me, had been for years. Just work stuff, boring financial paperwork, he'd always said when I'd offered to help organize it. You don't need to worry your pretty head about any of it. Your pretty head. The phrase made my skin crawl now. I'd never questioned his privacy before. Trusting wives don't snoop through their husbands' files. But wives whose husbands sabotage their brakes aren't exactly living in normal marriages, are they? His filing cabinet was locked, but I knew Brad. He wasn't creative with hiding spots. I found the key in his desk drawer, taped under the pencil tray. Same place he'd hidden Christmas presents for 20 years. The insurance policy was in the first folder I opened. $2 million. Exactly as I'd remembered. But there were other papers with it. Beneficiary forms, claim procedures, contact information for the insurance agent. He'd done his homework. Then I found the life insurance application, my medical information, employment history, lifestyle questions, all filled out in Brad's handwriting, not mine. I stared at my supposed signature at the bottom. It was good, very good. Brad had always been artistic, plus his military training had included some document work he'd never talked about in detail. But I hadn't signed this application, which meant Brad had forged my signature on a $2 million life insurance policy. That's when I found the second folder. Financial statements I'd never seen before. Credit cards in my name that I'd never opened. A second mortgage on our house that I'd never signed. Bank statements showing large cash withdrawals from accounts I didn't know existed. My husband had been systematically destroying our financial life while planning my death. The third folder contained something that made my blood freeze. Maps. Hand-drawn maps of my regular routes. The library, the grocery store, Sarah's house, the literacy center. Notes about traffic patterns, road conditions, optimal timing. He'd been studying my movements for months. At the bottom of the stack was a calendar, my weekly schedule marked in Brad's handwriting. Doctor appointments, volunteer shifts, visits with Kyle, everything documented, planned, predicted. Today's date was circled in red with a single word. Today. He'd expected me to die today. After leaving Sarah's house, driving down Maple Street, hitting those sabotaged brakes at exactly the wrong moment. I photographed everything with my phone, hands shaking so badly I had to retake several shots. Then I put it all back exactly as I'd found it, locked the cabinet, and returned to bed. Brad was still sleeping peacefully beside me. Same man I'd shared breakfast with every morning for 22 years. Same man who'd brought me coffee in bed on Sundays, who'd helped me grade papers, who'd cried at Tyler's graduation. Same man who'd spent months planning my murder. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, mind racing. Why now? What had changed? We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. Our marriage wasn't passionate anymore, but it wasn't awful. We'd settled into comfortable middle age together. Then I remembered something that made everything click into place. 3 months ago, my mother had died, left me her house in Florida, fully paid off, worth about $400,000. I'd mentioned maybe selling it, using the money to travel in our retirement. Brad had been very interested in those plans, very supportive, very encouraging about the idea of having extra money to enjoy our golden years. Except, he'd apparently decided to enjoy his golden years without me. The next morning, I made breakfast as usual. Brad kissed my forehead, asked about my plans for the day, reminded me to drive carefully. "Always do," I replied, watching his face carefully. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. After he left for work, I called my sister Eleanor in Phoenix. Eleanor was a retired paralegal who'd always been the suspicious one in our family. "Ellie, I need help, and I need you to listen without interrupting because this is going to sound insane." I told her everything. Kyle's observation, Ray's findings, the files in Brad's office. Eleanor listened in silence until I finished. "Donna, you need to get out of that house right now. I can't just disappear. He'll know I'm onto him. Then you need evidence, real evidence, enough to put him away forever. How do I get that without getting myself killed?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Remember my friend Helen Martinez? The one who went through that messy divorce? She's FBI now, works white-collar crime." "Let me call her." "FBI? Ellie, this isn't white-collar crime. Insurance fraud, forgery, attempted murder for financial gain. Trust me, this is exactly Helen's area. She'll know what to do." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee, looking around at the home I'd loved for 15 years. The yellow walls I'd painted myself, the herb garden visible through the window, the refrigerator covered with Kyle's drawings. Everything felt contaminated now, poisoned by the knowledge that my husband had been sitting at this same table, eating meals I'd cooked, planning my death. My phone buzzed with a text from Brad. "How's the car running today? Hope Ray finds everything in good shape." I stared at the message, seeing the carefully crafted concern for what it really was. Surveillance. I typed back, "Everything's fine. Ray says just routine stuff." Then I deleted the conversation and started planning how to stay alive long enough to put my husband in prison. Because that's where this was heading. This wasn't a marriage counseling situation. This was a federal case. And I was going to make sure Brad Jenkins learned exactly what happened to men who underestimated their wives. Helen Martinez arrived at my house the next morning, dressed like any other suburban professional. Mid-40s, competent smile, the kind of woman who could blend into any PTA meeting or book club. She was also a federal agent with 15 years of experience in financial crimes and domestic terrorism. "Eleanor told me the basics," she said, sitting at my kitchen table. "But I need you to walk me through everything from the beginning. Every detail, every document, every conversation you can remember." I showed her Ray's photos, the pictures I'd taken of Brad's files, Kyle's innocent revelation that had started everything. Helen took notes in a small notebook, occasionally asking questions that made me realize how much I'd missed. "The life insurance policy," she said. "When was it purchased?" 18 months ago, right after his friend Jim died. "And Jim's death was natural causes?" The question stopped me cold. I assumed so. "Heart attack," Brad said. "Jim was overweight, high blood pressure." Helen made another note. We'll need to look into that. What about other friends, family members? Anyone else who's died unexpectedly around your husband? My mouth went dry. You think there have been others? Men who are willing to murder their wives for insurance money rarely start with their wives. There's usually a pattern, a progression. Family members, friends, people he could practice on. I thought about Brad's Uncle Frank, who died in a car accident 2 years ago. Brad had been devastated, or at least that's how it had seemed. Frank had left Brad his vintage Mustang and a small inheritance. His Uncle Frank, I said slowly. Car accident. Single vehicle, lost control on a wet road. Helen's pen stopped moving. Your husband was the beneficiary? Partially. Frank didn't have children. We'll need to examine that case too. Helen closed her notebook. Donna, I'm going to be direct with you. If your husband has done this before, if there's a pattern, then you're in immediate danger. Not just from sabotaged breaks, but from escalation. When killers feel cornered, they get desperate. What do you suggest? First, we need you wired. Everything Brad says to you from now on needs to be recorded. Second, we need surveillance on him. If he's planning something else, we need to catch him in the act. Helen opened her briefcase and pulled out a device the size of a button. This goes in your jacket pocket. Voice-activated, 8-hour battery life. FBI-grade equipment. What if he finds it? Then you run, immediately. Don't pack. Don't hesitate. Just run. That afternoon, I wore the wire to have lunch with Brad at his favorite restaurant. He'd suggested it that morning, saying we needed to spend more quality time together. Quality time. Right. You seem tense lately, Brad said over his burger. Everything okay? Just thinking about Mom's house in Florida. All the decisions I need to make. His expression shifted subtly. What kind of decisions? Whether to sell, whether to keep it as a rental property. Financial stuff. I might need to talk to a lawyer about the tax implications. I could help with that, he said quickly. No need to involve lawyers for simple estate planning. I forced a smile. That's sweet, but this is pretty complex. Mom had some interesting investments I'm just learning about. Brad's fork paused halfway to his mouth. What kind of investments? CDs, some stocks, a trust fund I didn't know existed. Apparently I inherited more than just the house. This was a complete lie. Mom had died with barely enough money to cover her funeral expenses, but I wanted to see how Brad would react to the possibility of more money. He tried to look pleased, but I saw the calculation in his eyes. The adjustment of plans. That's wonderful, honey. How much more? The lawyer said maybe another $300,000. Once everything's settled, Brad nearly choked on his water. $300,000? Could be more. The trust fund has some restrictions, but after I turn 60, it all becomes available. I was 58. In Brad's mind, I'm sure he was doing math. 2 years to wait, or speed up the timeline. We should celebrate, he said. Maybe take that trip to Europe we've talked about. That sounds lovely. I reached across the table and took his hand. I'm so lucky to have such a supportive husband. Brad squeezed my fingers, smiling that loving smile. I just want you to be happy, Donna. That's all I've ever wanted. The wire caught every word. That evening, Helen called with an update. We've been monitoring Brad's phone and computer activities. He's been researching untraceable poisons, ways to stage accidents, and he's made contact with someone who specializes in forged documents. More forgeries? We think he's trying to get access to your mother's supposed estate. Create documents that would make him the beneficiary instead of you. I sat down heavily in my chair. How long has he been planning this? Based on the digital evidence, at least 2 years, maybe longer. Donna, there's something else. We ran background checks on the other deaths in Brad's circle. His Uncle Frank, his friend Jim, and his former business partner Gary 3 years ago. Gary died of cancer. Gary died of poisoning that presented as cancer. The symptoms are nearly identical if you use the right combination of chemicals. Your husband's military background included chemical warfare training. He'd know exactly what compounds to use. My stomach turned over. How many people has he killed? We're not sure yet, but we think you were never meant to be his first victim. You were meant to be his biggest payday. After Helen left, I sat in my kitchen staring at the herb garden where Brad grew tomatoes every summer. He'd always been so proud of those tomatoes. So knowledgeable about soil composition and fertilizers. fertilizers that could be turned into poisons if you knew what you were doing, which, apparently, he did. I called Eleanor. Ellie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. What is it? That summer 3 years ago when you visited us. You got sick, remember? Food poisoning, we thought. Silence. Then, Donna, what are you saying? You were sick for weeks after you went home. Lost 15 pounds. Your doctor couldn't figure out what was wrong. You think Brad poisoned me? I think Brad has been practicing. Eleanor's voice was shaky when she spoke again. Oh my God, if you hadn't figured this out. I know, but I did figure it out. And now I'm going to make sure he pays for all of it. Because Helen was right about one thing. When cornered killers got desperate, but they also got sloppy. And I was betting that Brad Jenkins was about to make the mistake that would put him away forever. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Brad announced over breakfast that he wanted to take me on a romantic weekend getaway to the Wisconsin Dells. Just the two of us, he said, buttering his toast with elaborate casualness. We could stay at that bed and breakfast you liked, the one with the fireplace in every room. That sounds wonderful, I replied, while every instinct screamed danger. When were you thinking? This weekend. I already made reservations. Of course he had. Remote location, isolated rooms, probably cash transactions that wouldn't leave much of a paper trail. I'd bet my life insurance policy that Brad had researched the perfect spot for a tragic accident. I called Helen the moment Brad left for work. He wants to take me away for the weekend, I told her. Isolated bed and breakfast, 3 hours from home. Perfect, Helen said, and my stomach dropped. Perfect? Helen, he's going to try to kill me. Yes, he is. And we're going to be ready for him. Donna, this is our chance to catch him in the act with overwhelming evidence. If we arrest him now, a good lawyer might get the charges reduced. But if we catch him attempting murder, with me as the intended victim, you won't be alone. We'll have agents positioned around the property. You'll be wearing multiple recording devices. The moment Brad makes a move, we'll be there. What if you're not fast enough? Helen's voice was steady, professional. Then I'll spend the rest of my career making sure Brad Jenkins never sees daylight again. Not exactly the reassurance I was hoping for, but it would have to do. That afternoon, I drove to Ray's garage to pick up my car. He'd installed a tracking device and what he called a few other modifications that Helen had requested. What kind of modifications? I asked. Ray smiled grimly. Let's just say if someone tries to mess with your brakes again, they're in for a surprise. I don't understand. Mrs. Jenkins, my brother works for the FBI. I've made a few cars for undercover work. Your Honda isn't quite as helpless as it looks anymore. Friday afternoon, Brad loaded our weekend bags into his truck. Leave your car here, he said. Save gas, and I like driving us places. Of course he wanted to control the transportation. Can't stage a convincing car accident if the intended victim might be able to escape. That's sweet, I said, climbing into the passenger seat. I love when you drive. The bed and breakfast was exactly what I'd expected. Isolated, charming, the kind of place where a grieving widower could tell a tragic story about his wife's accidental fall from their balcony. The room Brad had selected was on the 3rd floor with a stunning view of the river valley and a balcony with a railing that looked suspiciously low. Beautiful view, I commented, stepping outside to admire the scenery while noting the 30-foot drop to the rocky riverbank below. Breathtaking, Brad agreed, standing behind me, a little too close behind me. That evening at dinner, Brad was more attentive than he'd been in years, ordering wine, holding my hand, gazing into my eyes like we were newlyweds. I want you to know how much I love you, he said over dessert. How grateful I am for all our years together. That sounds almost like a goodbye, I said lightly. Brad's smile flickered. Not goodbye, just appreciation. Life's so fragile, isn't it? You never know what tomorrow might bring. The wire caught every meaningful look, every loaded pause, every carefully chosen word. Back in our room, Brad suggested we open the bottle of champagne he'd brought. Special occasion, he said. Time to celebrate our love. I watched him pour the drinks, noting how he turned slightly away from me while handling my glass. When he handed it to me, I saw the faint residue at the bottom that hadn't quite dissolved. To us, Brad said, raising his glass. To us, I echoed. bringing the glass to my lips, but not drinking. Brad drained his champagne in 3 swallows, then set his glass down and moved to the sliding door that led to the balcony. "Let's watch the stars," he said. "The sky's so clear tonight." It was 11:47 p.m., prime time for tragic accidents when the victim was too drugged to resist and too groggy to scream effectively. I followed Brad onto the balcony, still holding my untouched champagne. The night air was cool, the railing exactly as low as I'd feared. "Donna," Brad said, moving behind me again. "I need to tell you something." "What's that, honey?" His hands settled on my shoulders, then moved to my waist. "I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" "For what I have to do." That's when he pushed. Or tried to push. But I'd spent the last week working with Helen's team, learning how to shift my weight, how to turn unexpected momentum into controlled movement. Instead of going over the railing, I spun sideways and stepped clear. Brad stumbled forward, off balance from his own force, and grabbed the railing to steady himself. "FBI! Nobody move!" Floodlights blazed from multiple directions as agents surrounded the balcony. Helen's voice came through a bullhorn. "Bradford Jenkins, you're under arrest for attempted murder." Brad turned to look at me, his face a mask of confusion and rage. "You knew?" "I knew," I confirmed. "What I don't understand is why." 22 years, Brad. Was I really that much of a burden? "It wasn't personal," he said as agents handcuffed him. "It was just business. Just business. 22 years of marriage, and my murder would have been just business." As they led Brad away, Helen appeared at my side. "You okay?" "I'm fine. Did you get everything you need?" Helen smiled. "Attempted murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and based on what we found in his phone records tonight, we're reopening 3 other suspicious deaths. Your husband just bought himself a life sentence." I looked out over the balcony where I'd almost died, thinking about Kyle's innocent observation that had saved my life. Children really do see everything, don't they? Even when the adults around them are too trusting to notice. Maybe, especially then. The next morning, sitting in an FBI conference room in Milwaukee, I learned just how deep Brad's planning had gone. Helen spread photographs and documents across the table like playing cards, each one revealing another layer of my husband's deception. The bed and breakfast was researched extensively, she explained. He'd visited 3 times in the past 6 months, always alone, always paying cash. He met with the owner twice to discuss the perfect romantic room for his wife. He was rehearsing. More than that. He was establishing a relationship, creating witnesses who would testify about what a devoted husband he was. Helen pulled out a transcript. "Here's what the owner told our agents this morning. Mr. Jenkins was so thoughtful, wanted everything perfect for his wife's birthday surprise. He specifically asked about the room with the balcony, said she loved scenic views. My birthday wasn't until December. It was currently September. What about the other deaths? Uncle Frank and the others?" Helen's expression grew grim. "Frank Jenkins died in a car accident, but the mechanic who examined the wreckage found evidence of brake line tampering. Similar to what happened to your car, but more sophisticated. Your husband was learning, improving his technique. And Jim? James Morrison died of apparent heart failure, but we're exhuming the body for toxicology tests. Gary Patterson, the business partner, died of what appeared to be cancer, but his symptoms match certain rare poisoning patterns. Brad's military chemical training explains how he knew exactly which compounds to use." I stared at the photographs of 3 men I'd known, 3 men I'd mourned with Brad. "How long do you think he's been doing this?" "Based on the financial records we've uncovered, possibly a decade. Small amounts at first, learning how to forge documents, studying poison interactions, perfecting accident scenarios." Helen leaned forward. "Donna, your husband wasn't just a murderer. He was a serial killer who specialized in people who trusted him." The room felt cold despite the warm September afternoon. "What about Eleanor? When she got sick that summer?" "We're flying her to Milwaukee this afternoon. FBI medical team wants to run some tests, see if there are any lingering effects from whatever Brad gave her. And if there are, then we add attempted murder to his charges." Agent Davis, Helen's partner, entered the room carrying a laptop. "The search of the Jenkins house is complete. You need to see this." Davis opened the laptop and showed me photographs of a hidden room in our basement. Behind a false wall that I'd never noticed was a complete laboratory setup. Chemistry equipment, reference books on toxicology, detailed notes on dozens of different poisons and their effects. "This is a 10-year collection," Davis said. "Your husband has been studying murder the way some people study stamp collecting." There were files on every person Brad had ever killed or attempted to kill. Photos, personal information, relationship details, and what he called elimination protocols. Each file contained practice schedules, timing charts, and backup plans. My file was 3 inches thick. "He'd been planning your death for 2 years, Helen said softly. "Ever since your mother was diagnosed with cancer, and he realized you might inherit property. But he changed the timeline when I told him about the fictional trust fund." "Exactly. We found his revised plans. Originally, he was going to wait until your 60th birthday, make it look like you fell down the stairs at home. But when he thought there was more money involved, he got greedy." Davis pulled up another file. "There's something else. Brad wasn't working alone." The screen showed email exchanges between Brad and someone called M. Stevens. Detailed discussions about document forgery, poison procurement, and what looked like a fee structure for professional services. "Who's M. Stevens?" "Martha Stevens, professional forger with clients across 3 states. She's been selling Brad fake death certificates, modified medical records, altered insurance policies. We arrested her 2 hours ago." I thought about all the papers I'd found in Brad's office, all those perfect signatures that I'd assumed he'd forged himself. How many people were involved in planning my murder? "At least 4 that we know of so far," Helen said. "Brad, Martha, a chemist named Robert Cruz who was supplying untraceable poisons, and someone we're still identifying who was providing surveillance equipment." "Surveillance equipment?" Davis showed me more photos from the basement laboratory. Tiny cameras, listening devices, GPS trackers. "Brad has been monitoring your movements for over a year. He knew everywhere you went, everyone you talked to, every routine you followed." That explained so much. How Brad always seemed to know when I'd be home from the grocery store. Why he'd started texting me during my volunteer shifts at the literacy center. Why he'd been so interested in my weekly coffee dates with my friend Margaret. Was Margaret in danger? We don't think so. But we're warning everyone in your social circle to be careful until we've rounded up all of Brad's associates. The meeting lasted another 3 hours. Forms to sign, statements to give, protection protocols to discuss. The FBI was taking Brad's operation seriously, treating it as an organized criminal enterprise rather than simple domestic violence. "When can I go home?" I asked. Helen and Davis exchanged glances. "Donna, we don't recommend that. Brad's associates don't know he's been arrested yet. If they think you're a threat to their operation, you think they might come after me? We think they might try to clean up loose ends." "Yes." So I was moved to a safe house in Madison, a comfortable suburban ranch with FBI agents posing as neighbors. My sister Eleanor arrived that evening, pale and shaken after her medical evaluation. "They found traces," she said without preamble. "Heavy metals in my blood. Damage to my kidneys that the doctors couldn't explain 3 years ago. Brad poisoned me." We sat in the safe house kitchen, drinking tea and processing the reality that my husband had tried to kill my sister as practice for killing me. "Why didn't you die?" I asked. "Not that I'm complaining, but if Brad was trying to poison you." "I left earlier than planned. Remember? My flight got moved up because of that storm system. I was supposed to stay another week, long enough for the poison to work." Eleanor nodded. "The FBI doctor thinks Brad was using me to test dosages, timing, delivery methods. If I'd stayed the full visit, you'd be dead, and he'd have known exactly how to kill me." That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in a house guarded by federal agents, I thought about the strange series of events that had saved my life. Kyle's innocent observation, Ray's willingness to help, Eleanor's suspicious nature, Helen's expertise. But mostly, I thought about the fact that my husband of 22 years had been planning to murder me for 2 of those years, and I'd never suspected a thing. Tomorrow, I would start rebuilding my life without the man who had systematically destroyed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. But tonight, I was just grateful to be alive. 3 weeks later, I stood in the hallway of the Milwaukee County Courthouse, watching Brad's arraignment through a window. He looked smaller somehow, older, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his usual flannel shirts and jeans. His lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Peterson, was arguing for reduced bail. "Your Honor, Mr. Jenkins has no prior criminal record, strong ties to the community, and poses no flight risk." The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, stood up immediately. "Your Honor, the defendant is charged with conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, insurance fraud, and we expect additional charges as our investigation continues. He's organized a criminal enterprise spanning multiple states with at least 4 confirmed victims." "Alleged victims," Peterson corrected. "No," Walsh replied coldly. "Confirmed victims. James Morrison's exhumed body tested positive for 3 different rare toxins. Frank Jenkins's car accident has been reclassified as homicide. Gary Patterson's medical records show poisoning patterns consistent with a 2-year systematic murder plan." The judge, a stern woman named Harriet Blackwood, reviewed the documents in front of her. "Mr. Peterson, your client is accused of operating what amounts to a murder-for-profit scheme. Bail is denied." Brad's shoulders sagged. He turned toward the gallery, scanning the faces until he found mine. For a moment, our eyes met through the glass. He looked confused, as if he genuinely couldn't understand how his perfect plan had fallen apart. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no satisfaction. Just a strange emptiness where 22 years of love used to be. After the hearing, Helen drove me to the FBI field office for another debriefing. The investigation had expanded beyond anything I'd imagined. "Martha Stevens is cooperating," Helen said as we walked through the building. "She's provided documentation for over 30 forged death certificates, modified insurance policies, and fake medical records. Brad's operation was much larger than we initially thought." 30 people? No, 30 cases. Some clients had multiple victims. This was essentially a murder consulting business. In the conference room, Agent Davis had set up a timeline covering an entire wall. Names, dates, locations, all connected by colored strings like something from a crime drama. "Brad started small," Davis explained. "Insurance fraud, minor document forgery, helping people fake their own deaths for financial reasons. But about 5 years ago, he transitioned into actual murder for hire." Who was hiring him? Spouses mostly. People who wanted their partners dead but didn't want to do it themselves. Brad provided the expertise, the planning, the execution. His clients maintained plausible deniability. Helen pointed to a cluster of cases in Wisconsin and Minnesota. "We think he was responsible for at least 12 deaths in the past 5 years. Always made to look accidental, always with significant insurance payouts. What made him decide to kill me?" "I wasn't paying him." "You weren't a client," Davis said. "You were a test case. Brad was developing new methods, perfecting his techniques. Your death would have provided both money and proof of concept for his more sophisticated approaches." I stared at the timeline, seeing my name at the far right with today's date circled in red. The end point of a decade-long progression from petty fraud to serial murder. How many people would be alive today if Kyle hadn't mentioned seeing Brad under my car? "Impossible to say," Helen replied, "but we found evidence that Brad was already planning his next client consultation. A woman in Minneapolis whose husband wanted her dead. What happens to her now?" "She's safe. We arrested the husband this morning. Conspiracy to commit murder based on the emails we found on Brad's computer." Over the following days, the story dominated local news. Suburban serial killer caught by grandson's observation. FBI breaks up murder for hire ring. Milwaukee woman escapes husband's death plot. I stopped reading the articles after the third reporter called me lucky. As if discovering that your husband was a serial killer who'd spent 2 years planning your murder was some kind of blessing. Tyler and Sarah were devastated. They'd loved Brad, trusted him completely, welcomed him into their family without question. The knowledge that he'd been planning to murder Tyler's mother while playing grandfather to Tyler's son had shattered something fundamental in their world. "I keep thinking about all the times he was alone with Kyle," Sarah said when she visited the safe house. "All the times he volunteered to babysit, to take Kyle to the park. What if..." He wasn't interested in children, I assured her. Kyle was never in danger. How can you be sure? Helen, who was present for the conversation, answered, based on our profile analysis, your stepfather-in-law was motivated purely by financial gain. Children don't typically have life insurance policies or inheritable assets. They weren't useful to his operation. It was a cold comfort, but it was comfort nonetheless. 2 months after Brad's arrest, I stood in the living room of what used to be our house, sorting through belongings under FBI supervision. Everything was evidence until the investigation concluded, but they'd allowed me to collect personal items and sentimental belongings. I picked up a photo of our wedding day, Brad and me looking impossibly young and happy. 25-year-old Donna in white lace, 27-year-old Brad in a rented tuxedo, both of us believing we were starting a fairy tale life together. Take it or leave it, Helen asked, noting my hesitation. Leave it, I said, setting the photo back on the mantel. That woman doesn't exist anymore. The woman who'd emerged from Brad's murder plot was stronger, wiser, and infinitely more suspicious of people who seemed too good to be true. She was also angrier than she'd expected to be. Not at Brad, necessarily. He was what he was, a predator who'd hidden his nature behind a mask of suburban normalcy. But at herself, for being so trusting, so naive, so willfully blind to the signs that must have been there all along. Helen seemed to read my thoughts. Don't blame yourself for not seeing it. Psychopaths are experts at manipulation. They study normal human behavior and mimic it perfectly. You weren't stupid for trusting him. You were human. Human stupidity nearly got me killed. Human kindness kept you alive. You noticed Kyle's observation because you pay attention to children. You called the mechanic because you trust your instincts. You cooperated with us because you believe in justice. Those are good qualities, Donna. Don't let Brad's evil make you cynical about your own goodness. Easy for her to say. She wasn't the one who'd spent 22 years sleeping next to a man who was planning her murder. But as I walked through the house collecting the pieces of my former life, I realized Helen was right about one thing. I was still alive. Brad's plan had failed completely, and there was something deeply satisfying about that fact. Something that felt very much like victory. The trial began on a cold February morning, 4 months after my would-be murder at the Wisconsin Dells. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing the navy blue suit I'd bought specifically for this day. Brad entered the courtroom in shackles, his hair grayer than I remembered, his face thinner. He looked like what he was, a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed around him. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. Assistant District Attorney Walsh laid out the entire conspiracy with clinical precision, using charts, timelines, and photographs to illustrate the scope of Brad's criminal enterprise. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Walsh said, this is not a crime of passion. This is not a momentary lapse in judgment. This is the story of a man who spent over a decade building a business around murder, who turned killing into a systematic, profitable enterprise. She showed photographs of Brad's victims. Frank Jenkins, smiling at a family barbecue. James Morrison at his daughter's wedding. Gary Patterson holding a newborn grandchild. Each photo was followed by crime scene images, autopsy reports, evidence of how Brad had ended their lives. And then, Walsh continued, there's Donna Jenkins, the defendant's wife of 22 years, who survived only because of an innocent observation from her 6-year-old grandson. The defense attorney, Peterson, tried a different approach. His opening statement painted Brad as a man driven to desperation by financial pressure, a loving husband who'd made terrible choices but wasn't the mastermind of an organized criminal enterprise. My client is guilty of poor judgment, Peterson said. Guilty of fraud, guilty of deception. But the prosecution wants you to believe he's some kind of criminal genius, a calculated killer who orchestrated elaborate murder plots. The truth is much simpler. Bradford Jenkins is a weak man who got in over his head with dangerous people. It was a reasonable strategy, but it fell apart during the first day of testimony. Martha Stevens, the document forger, testified about her business relationship with Brad. He was very professional, she said from the witness stand. Always paid on time, always provided clear specifications for what he needed. Death certificates. Insurance modifications, identity documents. He knew exactly what he wanted and how to use it. How many documents did you create for Mr. Jenkins over the past 5 years? Walsh asked. 47 different items. Death certificates for 6 different people, modified insurance policies for 8 clients, fake medical records for 12 individuals. And Mr. Jenkins paid you how much for these services? $240,000 over 5 years. The jury absorbed this information silently. Peterson tried to minimize the damage during cross-examination, suggesting that Martha was the real criminal mastermind and Brad was simply one of her customers. But Martha wasn't having it. Mr. Jenkins provided the planning, she said firmly. I just provided the paperwork. He would tell me exactly what documents he needed, when he needed them, and how they fit into his timeline. This was his operation. The second day brought Ray Patterson, my mechanic, who testified about the brake line sabotage on my car. He'd brought photographs, technical diagrams, and piece of the actual brake line to demonstrate how the tampering had been done. This wasn't random vandalism, Ray explained to the jury. This was surgical work, designed to create brake failure at a specific time under specific conditions. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. In your expert opinion, Walsh asked, how much automotive knowledge would someone need to perform this type of sabotage? 20 years minimum. You'd need to understand hydraulic systems, metal fatigue patterns, and timing mechanisms. This was the work of someone with serious mechanical expertise. Peterson's cross-examination focused on the possibility that someone else had sabotaged my car, but Ray shot that down immediately. Mrs. Jenkins' car was in her garage every night, Ray said. The only person with consistent access was her husband. Day 3 was Kyle's testimony, conducted in the judge's chambers with only essential personnel present. I watched through a video link as my 6-year-old grandson, looking impossibly small in the big leather chair, answered questions about what he'd seen. Can you tell us what Grandpa Brad did after Grandma Donna drove away? The prosecutor asked gently. He went to the garage and got his tools, Kyle said matter-of-factly. Then he crawled under Grandma's car and did stuff to it. What kind of stuff? Touching things with his screwdriver. Making little noises like fixing things, but quiet. Did Grandpa Brad know you were watching? Kyle shook his head solemnly. I was supposed to be napping, but I was looking out the window instead. Even through the video link, I could see the impact Kyle's testimony had on the jury. This wasn't a coached witness or someone with an agenda. This was a child, reporting what he'd seen with the honest clarity that only children possess. The 4th day brought the FBI forensics team, who testified about the evidence found in our basement laboratory. Agent Richardson, the lead forensics specialist, walked the jury through photographs of Brad's murder planning room. This represents approximately 10 years of systematic research, Richardson testified. We found detailed files on 37 different individuals, comprehensive notes on various poison interactions, timing charts for staging different types of accidents, and what appeared to be practice schedules for perfecting different murder techniques. Practice schedules? Walsh asked. The defendant kept detailed records of his practice sessions, when he tested different poisons on laboratory animals, when he practiced document forgery, when he rehearsed breaking into vehicles to plant tracking devices. This was methodical preparation for criminal activity. Peterson's cross-examination was increasingly desperate. Agent Richardson, isn't it possible that my client was writing crime fiction? That these weren't actual murder plans, but creative writing exercises? Richardson looked at Peterson with barely concealed contempt. Mr. Peterson, your client's creative writing resulted in 6 confirmed deaths and 1 attempted murder. If this was fiction, it was remarkably deadly fiction. On the 5th day, I testified. Walsh had prepared me extensively for this moment, but sitting in the witness box, looking out at the jury, I felt the weight of everything that had brought me to this point. Mrs. Jenkins, Walsh began, how long were you married to the defendant? 22 years. During that time, did you ever suspect that your husband was involved in criminal activity? No. Brad was... He seemed like the most normal man in the world. Reliable, predictable, boring even. He went to work, came home, watched television, worked in his garden. If someone had told me a year ago that my husband was a serial killer, I would have laughed at them. What changed? I looked across the courtroom at Brad, who was staring at his hands. My grandson Kyle noticed something I'd been too trusting to see. Children notice everything, don't they? They don't make the same assumptions adults do about the people they're supposed to be able to trust. Walsh walked me through the timeline of discovery, from Kyle's observation to Ray's findings to the FBI investigation. I testified about finding the files in Brad's office, about the forged insurance documents, about the maps of my daily routines. How did it feel, Walsh asked, to discover that your husband of 22 years had been planning your murder? Peterson objected to the question as irrelevant, but Judge Blackwood allowed it. It felt like waking up in someone else's life, I said, like discovering that everything I thought I knew about my own existence was a lie. The man I'd shared a bed with, cooked meals for, planned a future with, he'd been studying me like a laboratory animal, figuring out the most efficient way to kill me. Are you afraid of the defendant? No, I said, and realized I meant it. I'm not afraid of Brad anymore. He's a pathetic man who thought he was clever enough to get away with murder. He was wrong. During cross-examination, Peterson tried to paint me as vindictive, suggesting that I'd fabricated evidence or collaborated with the FBI to frame an innocent man. Mrs. Jenkins, isn't it true that you and your husband were having marital problems? That you wanted out of the marriage and saw this as an opportunity to destroy him? Mr. Peterson, I said calmly, if I wanted to destroy my husband, I wouldn't have needed to make anything up. His own actions were quite sufficient. But you were angry about the insurance policy, weren't you? Angry that your husband had taken out a policy on your life without telling you? I was angry about a lot of things. I was angry that my husband forged my signature on legal documents. I was angry that he'd been poisoning my sister. I was angry that he'd murdered his uncle and his best friend. But mostly, I was angry that he'd turned our entire marriage into an elaborate murder plot. Peterson pressed harder. Mrs. Jenkins, isn't it possible that you misinterpreted innocent activities? That your husband's interest in your daily routines was simple concern for your safety? I looked at him for a long moment, then turned to address the jury directly. Ladies and gentlemen, I know how this sounds. I know it's hard to believe that someone could live with a serial killer for 22 years and not know it. But that's exactly what predators count on. Our inability to believe that evil can wear such a normal face. My husband didn't fail because I was particularly smart or observant. He failed because a 6-year-old boy happened to be looking out a window at the wrong time. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Judge Blackwood sentenced Brad to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As they led him away, Brad turned to look at me one last time. His mouth moved, and I thought he might be saying, "I'm sorry," but I couldn't hear him over the sound of the courtroom door closing. 6 months after Brad's sentencing, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment, making coffee for one and reading the morning newspaper. The front page carried a story about Martha Stevens receiving 15 years for her role in the murder conspiracy, but I barely glanced at it. I was more interested in the real estate section. The insurance money from the policies Brad had taken out on the victims had been seized as proceeds of criminal activity, but my mother's house in Florida remained untouched. I'd finally decided to sell our Milwaukee home. Too many memories, too much contaminated history, and move somewhere warmer. Somewhere without associations to my old life. St. Petersburg looked promising. Near the water, reasonable cost of living, enough distance from Wisconsin that I was unlikely to run into reporters or curious neighbors who wanted to discuss my experience as the woman who survived the suburban serial killer. My phone rang as I was circling apartments ads. Tyler's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, honey. Mom, how are you doing?" The question that had become a ritual between us. Tyler checked on me every few days now, still processing the guilt of having loved and trusted the man who'd tried to murder his mother. "I'm fine, Tyler. Actually, I'm great. I'm thinking about moving to Florida." "Florida? That's sudden?" "Not really. I've been thinking about it since Mom died. Now seems like the right time for a fresh start." Tyler was quiet for a moment. "Are you running away?" "No," I said, surprised by the question. "I'm running toward something." "There's a difference." "What are you running toward?" I thought about that. What was I looking for in Florida, besides distance from the past? Freedom, I think. The freedom to be whoever I want to be, instead of who everyone thinks I should be. What do you mean? Tyler, for the past year, I've been the woman who survived, the victim who got lucky, the wife who was too naive to see what was right in front of her. I'm tired of being defined by what Brad did to me. You're not a victim, Mom. No, I'm not. I'm a woman who figured out she was in danger and did something about it. I'm a woman who helped the FBI take down a serial killer. I'm a woman who survived 22 years with a psychopath and came out stronger. Tyler laughed. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from him in months. When you put it that way, you sound pretty formidable. I am pretty formidable. It just took me 58 years to figure that out. After we hung up, I continued reading the real estate ads. But my mind wandered to something Helen Martinez had mentioned during our last meeting. Have you ever thought about writing a book? She'd asked. Your story could help other women recognize the warning signs, understand their legal rights. At the time, I'd dismissed the idea. Who would want to read about my experience? What could I possibly say that would be helpful to anyone else? But sitting in my apartment, thinking about moving to Florida, starting over, creating a new life from scratch, I realized Helen might be right. Not about writing a book, necessarily, but about helping other women. I thought about all the wives and daughters and mothers who might be living with their own versions of Brad. Men who seemed loving and normal on the surface, but were planning something terrible underneath. Women who, like me, were too trusting to see the signs until it was almost too late. I pulled out my laptop and started writing. During breakfast, my 6-year-old grandson looked up from his cereal and said something that saved my life. 3 hours later, I had 5 pages. A week later, I had 20. A month later, I had the outline for something that might actually become a book. But more importantly, I had a purpose. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday afternoon in November. I opened it to find a young woman in her 30s, nervously twisting her wedding ring. Are you Donna Jenkins? The woman who... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The woman whose husband tried to kill her? Yes, that's me. How can I help you? My name is Lisa Chen. I read about your case in the newspaper. I think my husband might be planning something similar. I invited Lisa in, made her coffee, and listened to her story. Small things, she said. Her husband's sudden interest in her daily routine. Questions about her life insurance policy. Strange comments about how much easier his life would be if she weren't around to worry about. Everyone says I'm being paranoid, Lisa said. My family thinks I'm imagining things. But when I read about your case, about how normal your husband seemed, what's your husband's name? David Chen. He works for an insurance company. I felt a chill run down my spine. Lisa, has your husband ever asked you to sign papers without reading them? Has he ever made comments about your will or your beneficiaries? Lisa's face went pale. How did you know? I reached for my phone and called Helen Martinez. Helen, it's Donna. I'm sitting here with a woman named Lisa Chen, whose husband works in insurance and has been asking suspicious questions about her life insurance policy. Helen was at my apartment within an hour. 2 days later, David Chen was under FBI surveillance. A week after that, he was arrested for conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. Lisa had been 3 days away from an accidental fall down the stairs that would have killed her and netted David $500,000 in life insurance money. The case made national news. Serial killer's victim helps save another woman. FBI breaks up second murder plot with help from survivor. This time, I agreed to do interviews. What made you recognize the signs in Lisa's case? The reporter asked. Experience, I said. Once you've lived with a predator, once you understand how they operate, you develop instincts for recognizing the patterns. Do you think there are others out there? Other women in similar situations? I know there are. The FBI estimates that insurance-related domestic murder attempts are vastly underreported. Most of them succeed because the victims don't realize they're in danger until it's too late. What advice would you give to women who might be in similar situations? I looked directly into the camera. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. Don't dismiss your concerns because the person threatening you is someone you love. Love doesn't mean being naive about danger. And if they're not sure, then call someone. Call the police, call the FBI, call me if you have to. Don't try to handle it alone. The interview aired on a Thursday. By Friday, I'd received over 200 emails from women describing suspicious behavior from their husbands or boyfriends. Helen and I spent the weekend going through them, identifying the cases that warranted immediate investigation. 7 women were moved to safe houses. 4 men were arrested. 2 ongoing murder plots were stopped before they could be executed. That's when I realized what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I wasn't moving to Florida to hide from my past. I was moving to Florida to build something new on the foundation of my experience. A consulting business, maybe. A nonprofit organization. Something that helped women recognize when they were in danger and gave them the tools to protect themselves. I thought about Kyle, whose innocent observation had started everything. Children see what adults miss because they don't have preconceived notions about how people should behave. Maybe that was the key. Teaching women to see their relationships with the clarity of children, without the filters of love and trust that could blind them to danger. I called the real estate agent in St. Petersburg and made an offer on a small office building near the beach. Time to start saving lives instead of just surviving them. 1 year later, I stood in the sunny conference room of the Donna Jenkins Foundation for Domestic Safety, watching Lisa Chen address a group of 20 women whose husbands had been arrested for various murder plots. 6 months ago, I thought I was going crazy, Lisa said from the front of the room. My husband was so loving, so concerned about my well-being. When I started noticing strange things, the questions about my insurance, the sudden interest in my daily schedule, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. The women in the audience nodded knowingly. They'd all been through similar experiences. All struggled with the cognitive dissonance of loving someone who was planning to kill them. But Donna taught me that paranoia and survival instincts are sometimes the same thing, Lisa continued. Learning to trust what I was seeing instead of what I wanted to believe saved my life. After the meeting, I walked out onto the deck of our St. Petersburg office building, looking out over Tampa Bay while processing the day's conversations. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I first moved to Florida. We now employed 12 full-time staff members, former FBI agents, social workers, legal advocates, and financial counselors. Our hotline received over 100 calls per week. We'd helped law enforcement agencies in 15 states identify and prosecute domestic murder plots. The work was exactly as rewarding and exactly as heartbreaking as I'd expected. My phone rang. Tyler's name on the screen, as it was every Tuesday and Friday for our weekly check-ins. Hi, honey. How's my favorite grandson? Kyle's great. Actually, that's why I'm calling. He has something he wants to tell you. Kyle's voice came through the phone, excited and proud. Grandma Donna, I told my teacher about how I saved your life, and she wants me to talk to the whole class about paying attention to things that seem wrong. That sounds wonderful. Sweetheart, what are you going to tell them? That grown-ups sometimes don't see things because they think they already know what's happening. But kids notice everything because we don't know what's normal yet. Out of the mouths of babes. Kyle had inadvertently summarized the core philosophy of everything we were trying to teach at the foundation. Kyle, I said, you're absolutely right. Sometimes not knowing what's normal is exactly what makes you smart enough to see danger. After Tyler and Kyle hung up, I remained on the deck, watching fishing boats return to harbor as the sun set over the bay. My life in Florida was everything I'd hoped it would be. Meaningful work, warm weather, independence, and the satisfaction of turning my worst experience into something that helped other women survive similar situations. But the best part wasn't the work or the weather. The best part was the woman I'd become. The old Donna Jenkins had been trusting to the point of naivety, accommodating to the point of self-destruction, loving to the point of blindness. She'd spent 22 years married to a serial killer and never suspected a thing. The new Donna Jenkins was harder to fool. She asked questions, demanded documentation, trusted her instincts over her emotions. She'd built a business around helping other women develop the same suspicious clarity that had saved her life. My assistant, Rebecca, stuck her head out onto the deck. Donna, there's a call on line 2. FBI agent Martinez wants to discuss a case in Michigan. Helen Martinez had become both a close friend and a frequent collaborator. The foundation worked with law enforcement agencies across the country, providing consultation on cases that might involve domestic murder plots. "Put her through to my office," I said, gathering my things from the deck table. "Helen, what's happening in Michigan?" 3 suspicious deaths in the Grand Rapids area, all married women, all with significant life insurance policies, all with husbands who had access to automotive repair knowledge. Sound familiar? Very familiar. Are the husbands connected? That's what we're trying to figure out. The local police think they might be dealing with another Brad Jenkins situation, either a copycat killer or someone who learned from studying your case. What do you need from us? Your profile expertise. Can you review the case files and tell us if you see the same patterns you lived with? 2 hours later, I was reviewing photographs and police reports that made my skin crawl. 3 women, Jennifer Walsh, 42, Margaret Foster, 38, and Susan Brady, 45, had all died in car accidents involving brake failure. Their husbands, Kevin Walsh, David Foster, and Michael Brady, had all behaved exactly like Brad in the aftermath. Grief-stricken widowers who'd been devoted husbands, suddenly wealthy men who were already making plans for their insurance windfalls. But there were differences, too. These accidents had been more sophisticated than Brad's initial attempts, suggesting that someone had learned from his mistakes. I called Helen back. "These aren't coincidences," I told her. "Someone studied Brad's methods and improved on them. But I think there's something you missed." "What?" "Look at the timeline. Jennifer Walsh died 8 months ago. Margaret Foster died 6 months ago. Susan Brady died 4 months ago. That's an escalating pattern. Meaning? Meaning whoever's doing this is getting more confident, more efficient. The gaps between murders are shrinking. If the pattern holds, he's planning another murder soon. How soon? Based on the progression? 2 weeks? Maybe less." Helen was quiet for a moment. "Donna, we've identified 12 women in the Grand Rapids area whose husbands fit the profile. Similar financial situations, similar insurance policies, similar access to automotive equipment. Then you need to warn all 12, tonight. Already in progress. But we could use your help with the interviews. These women need to hear from someone who's been where they are. I'll be on a plane tomorrow morning." That night, packing for the trip to Michigan, I thought about how much my life had changed since Kyle's innocent observation at the breakfast table. I'd gone from potential victim to survivor, to advocate, to expert. But mostly, I'd gone from trusting everyone to trusting my instincts. And my instincts told me that Grand Rapids was about to become very dangerous for a lot of women. 3 days later, I sat in a hotel conference room with 11 women whose husbands were under FBI surveillance. The 12th woman, Patricia Murray, had been moved to a safe house after her husband was caught on camera tampering with her car's brake lines. "I know this is terrifying," I told the group. "I know it feels impossible to believe that the man you love, the man you sleep next to every night, could be planning to kill you. But I need you to understand something. Your survival depends on believing the evidence instead of believing the love." Patricia Murray raised her hand. "How do you get past it? How do you learn to trust anyone again?" "Slowly," I said honestly. "Very slowly. But the alternative is staying afraid forever. And I refuse to let murderers steal the rest of my life, along with the part they already took." "Do you date? Are you in a relationship?" I smiled, thinking about Daniel Morrison, the bookstore owner I'd been seeing for the past 3 months. A kind, patient man who understood that I needed extensive background checks and slow progress, who laughed when I asked Helen to run his name through FBI databases. "I am, actually. And the wonderful thing about having survived what we've survived is that we're really, really good at spotting red flags early." The women laughed, some for the first time in weeks. "Ladies," I continued, "what happened to us was terrible, but it also made us incredibly difficult to fool. Any man who wants to be in our lives now has to earn that privilege every single day. And honestly, that's how it should have been all along." 6 months later, I received a letter from Patricia Murray. Her husband had been sentenced to life in prison for murdering 3 women and attempting to murder a 4th. Patricia was in graduate school, studying criminal justice, planning to become a victim advocate. "You showed me that surviving wasn't enough," she wrote. "You showed me that I could turn survival into purpose." That evening, I walked on the beach near my apartment, thinking about Kyle's observation that had saved my life and changed everything that came after. Children see what adults miss because they don't make assumptions about how people should behave. Maybe that was the most important lesson of all, that love and trust should be earned, not assumed. That questions and vigilance aren't paranoia when your life depends on the answers. I pulled out my phone and called Kyle. "Grandma Donna!" His voice was bright with excitement. "Guess what? My teacher wants me to make a presentation for the whole school about paying attention to safety." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. What are you going to tell them?" "That if something seems wrong, it probably is wrong, and that kids should always tell grown-ups when they notice scary things, even if the grown-ups might not want to hear it." "Kyle, you're going to save a lot of lives with that presentation, just like you save lives with your job." Exactly like that. As I hung up, I realized that Kyle was right. We were both in the business of saving lives now. He taught children to notice danger and speak up about it. I taught women to trust their instincts and act on them. Different approaches, same goal. Making sure that innocent observations from 6-year-old boys weren't the only thing standing between predators and their victims. The sun was setting over Tampa Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new women in danger, new opportunities to turn tragedy into triumph. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be alive, independent, and absolutely impossible to fool. After 22 years of marriage to a serial killer, I'd finally learned the difference between love and survival. And I chose survival every single time. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.